I don't actually feel that I've ever failed. It's just not the way the world looks to me. So hopefully I can get across what you wanted me to get across. I'm going to start off where Josie left off with the pen story. Because you are going to die, whether you forget your pen or not. It doesn't really matter. It's a great motivator, it's a great leveler, it's the one thing we all have in common. It's the one thing we all have in common with all the people we admire, and it's also the one thing we have in common with anyone we might despise. But it gets better. Because that is the reality. No matter how much or how little we achieve, no matter how big or small we fail, we will be forgotten, and sooner than we think. So it was one of the things I remember when I've got 2 daughters. When we found out Sophie was pregnant with the first, I had a meal with the guy who was my best man, and one of the things I talked to him about is how do I get the point across to my kids in raising them that you are the world to us and you are wholly insignificant at the same time, because I want them to have that balance. As much as we think Steve Jobs has changed our lives, or Berners-Lee for inventing the internet, a time will come when nobody remembers their names, and the same will happen for us. So I'll come back to this, and if I do this right at the end, this will make more sense, and you'll see why it's actually a really positive thing. But I'll tell you a little bit about me. So I'm the one in the middle, in the front. One of 4, I was probably about 4 years old there, because my younger brother is in the photo, and then my sister would be 6 and Jan would be 10. Grew up in South Africa, and by certain measures had a very unhappy childhood. Parents split up when I was 9. My dad wasn't really around even before that. I've got very few memories of him, anything like that. But at the same time, I'm very aware that I was a white child in 1980s South Africa. So in that respect, I won the lottery. I went to school. I spent a year convincing my mum to let me leave school at 16. At the time, I don't know what it's changed now, but at the time, leaving school at 16 was very different to leaving school at 16, what my perception is of it here. It's very much a case of if you leave school at 16, whilst that is legal, it's because your only next option is prison. And that's sort of the career choice in front of you. So it took a long time to convince my mum, because I was in an academic school. I wanted to go and study electronics, electronic engineering. Worked through that. She said yes, eventually. I left school, went and studied electro-trade theory, industrial electronics, that kind of thing, and then just never enrolled in university. And it was the summer of '97 that a guy I was in a band with suggested that because of the change of regime in South Africa and everything like that, it's now a lot easier for us to travel abroad, and there's now a deal where you can come to the UK for a couple of years on a working holiday visa. I should consider doing that. And that sounded like a good idea to me. I had no other real plans. So I went home and told my mum I'm going to London. She said, how are you going to do that? I said, I'll make a plan. And a plan was made, and later that year I came over. And I think my mum potentially regretted that decision and letting me leave school early, because within a year of coming to the UK, I'd made it this far. And that's not me a year after I came to the UK, but that's the bench I slept on within a year of actually coming here. And I go back there at least once a year with my kids, because on the one hand it gives me perspective on where I am now, where it's come from, but I also want them to understand, whilst we do everything as parents to give them everything they need and give them all the opportunities possible, I want them to be aware that life could be very different. So we go and do that. And that brings me on to the 2 issues, I think, or things we should change about our relationship with failure. The one is time scale. We look at goals, and goal setting is great, but as, I don't know if he was the first one to say it, but Daniel Priestley has said that people always overestimate what they can achieve in a year and underestimate what they can achieve in 10. And that's just any failure that you come across and anything that doesn't work out the way you plan it. If you change the time scale that you look at, your perception of it changes completely. So I actually achieved a goal yesterday morning, 10 o'clock. That's taken me 21 years, 9 months and 2 days. So I got to go and do this. I am now, after all that time, I'm now a British citizen, which means I can get a passport, which means I can, for the first time in 8 years, go on holiday with my family. Stag weekends. And if you think about it, 21 years, 9 months, 2 days, at 10 years, you could have told me that it's failing, that it's not working. You could have done the same at 20. You could have done it at 21. But there are these goals in our lives that's really at the back of your mind, and you want to pursue all your goals in that way, that it's not a case of needing to do it by a certain date. And I understand with businesses there are quarters and there are annual returns, and we want to grow our businesses, but it's a much longer story than we necessarily perceive it to be. So I think if we change the way the time scale in which we view our failures or things that don't work out, it can have a massively positive effect on what we actually do and the risks that we're then willing to take, rather than it being so short term. So that's all of us now, everyone in that first photo. On the right is my older brother Jean, so I've got the privilege of being in business with him and working with him every day. My sister still lives in South Africa, and against the odds of all discouragement and never going to uni or anything like that, she's managed to work her way up to be a business analyst and mother of 2 and very successful. But this brings me to the guy on the left, my younger brother Nico, who in October achieved a goal that has taken him 27 years to So he wrote to give you a bit of context, he started playing piano when he was 14 months old. So the equivalent of Newsnight, but in South Africa the theme tune, just playing it in his diapers on the chair by ear with one finger. By the time he was 6, he'd written his first piece of music. So when he was 9, he wrote to the Royal Associate Board, who's in charge of the 4 Royal Colleges, and said, I'd like to come and study at the Royal College of Music, can you send me a prospectus? Which kindly they did. I don't think they know the impact that actually had. And when he was 17, there are 4 scholarships available every year, 1 to each of the Royal Colleges. It's available to applicants from 80 countries, and when he was 17 he got the one for the Royal Scottish College. And then he was in Glasgow for 4 years, got a scholarship to do a master's degree in Michigan, got a scholarship to do a master's degree at the Guildhall in London, because one master's degree is never enough. Then he got a scholarship to do a PhD at the Guildhall, which he now has. Now, based on his decision when he was 9, he's failed, because he doesn't hold a PhD from the Royal College of Music. In fact, he never got to study at the Royal College of Music. But over the time scale of 27 years, it's clear that the goal wasn't actually to study at the Royal College of Music. And if he was just focused on that one institution and achieving that one thing, he would have lost hope when he was 17 and didn't get into the Royal College of Music. He's now a visiting lecturer at the Royal College of Music, which I think is a bit better. So to go back to me being in the UK, I ended up getting off the bench. A much smellier version of me managed to get a job at a pub, which was a bit of a sliding doors moment, because in that pub I met my best man, the guys I ended up playing in a band with. I met my wife, and everything that went along with that. At the time that I met Sophie, I was illegally in the country and had been for 3.5 years. It was a lot easier to sneak in back then than it is now. So that was the conversation on our first date, is that if I'm picked up, I'll be gone in 24 hours, but let's go for a drink. So which worked out well. So then I left the pub, started working for her dad. He's got a building company. With background in electronics and stuff, I started doing bits of electrical work, decided to qualify as an electrician, which is when I then set up my first business. Had that for a couple of years and transitioned that into doing home automation, smart home, before Alexa and Google and all of that was around. And then in July of 2014, I had to pull the plug. Had to get liquidators in, go through the pleasures of creditors meetings and everything that goes on with that. And that whole thing from a legal perspective was actually only resolved in the first week in August this year. So it's been like a bit of a shadow for the last 5 years. And that can be seen as sort of quite a line in the sand failure. There's a clear date there. But it did two things for me. On the one hand, I realized, so it was the night before my 35th birthday. We were having dinner with some friends at the house, and this was the Saturday. I'd already decided that on the Monday, I hadn't told Sophie this at that stage, but on the Monday morning I was going to call the liquidator. And I realized that what I actually had was an opportunity on Monday morning to change my life. But I would submit to you that each and every one of us has that opportunity every morning we wake up. It doesn't have to get to a stage that I was in before you have that opportunity. That opportunity is there every time you wake up. And yes, there are risks involved, and you may end up with egg on your face or anything like that. But as we saw with that list, I mean, everything on the right-hand side, why wouldn't we want to experience the learning and extending our comfort zone and all of that? So that then went on, and I remember shortly after that, the week before the creditors meeting, I was in a mastermind meeting with Nigel Botterill, and the guy before me was saying what a nightmare he's had since the last meeting. His staff had nicked jobs and went off to work for other people and whatever. And I was just, well, thankfully I've got none of your problems, because as I sit here, I don't have a business. And the conversation went on, what am I going to do next, what am I going to try and do, whatever. And Nigel then just stopped and said, just make sure you put a flag here in the fact that you've created the enviable position that you can do whatever you want next. That there is nothing that's dictating what you can do next. And I think on the right time scale, each of us has that all the time. We're not really tied into anything. I mean, if you go with the original premise, you are going to die and people will forget your name. What you do next is not having the impact, or what you have done in the past is not tying you down as much as we think it is. But the biggest lesson for me was, and this comes back to what Nick was talking about us not doing the right thing, was we were having breakfast a few weeks, maybe 3 or 4 months later, and Amelie on the right was maybe 4, something like that, and she had these figurines of the Mr. Men. They came with cereal packets or whatever, but we ended up with about 30 of these things. And she just toddled up to the table and just said, Daddy used to be this, and now Daddy's this. And I always struggled with this. She was holding up Mr. Grumpy and Mr. Happy. And apart from the fact that it completely floored me, it was the biggest lesson, because from that day on, whatever business I build has to support a version of me that she can never say that again. Because no amount of money warrants a girl feeling like that. So at the moment, my business allows me, or actually I'm very focused on forcing my business to allow me, that I'd say 350 days of the year I have breakfast with all three of them. 350 days of the year I'm home when the two girls come home. The nanny drops them back, or their grandmother drops them back about 6. That's the end of my day. I don't wear a smartwatch anymore. I tend to leave my phone on my desk at 6 o'clock. When I hear the bell when they come home, that's it. We go for walks, go swimming in the river, much to the grandmother's distress. They climb trees, but I'll now start climbing trees with them. And that for me now is critical for our business. And that's for me the biggest lesson, or the biggest outcome from my business failing in 2014, is that life is immeasurably better for them because of that. And I'm focused on retaining that. So that brings me on to a movie with these two guys in it. So I don't know if some of you would recognize, that's El Capitan in Yosemite, and the bit of the rock that's actually illuminated is called the Dawn Wall, because it's the first bit of rock to get the sun for that. And these two guys decided, because no one has ever climbed from the bottom to the top, it's 3,200 feet, I think. People have climbed the other side of the rock, but no one's climbed the Dawn Wall. So these two decided that's what they're going to do. And this again is how we should change our perspective on failure. They essentially hung off that rock face for 6 years, trying not to climb it, trying to work out a route to the top. Because the way it works in climbing, and I now know a lot more about it than I ever did, is that would be made up out of, I think it was about 34 pitches. And each pitch is just a little section that you say, okay, I can do that bit, and then I can do this bit. The trick is, if you get halfway through a pitch and you fall, fine, the rope catches you, but you have to go back to the start of the pitch and carry on. You can't just carry on where you were halfway through. And our journeys through life and our failures and our attempts at succeeding are those pitches. And when they're on pitch 14, failing on pitch 14 means restarting pitch 14. It doesn't mean they failed climbing and scaling the Dawn Wall. So for 6 years they're hanging off it, and the detail with which they had to work is, and I never realized this, but them working out the route, it's not them sort of thinking, well, yeah, I reckon we can go this way and then that way. It's worked out by the finger. And it's to the extent of, okay, left hand here, raise right foot, adjust thumb on left hand, move hold on the right hand. That's the level with which they worked out over 6 years. What route is it? Because once you start at the bottom, now you're climbing. If you don't get to the top, then yes, you have failed to climb to the top of that mountain. And that's my office, because we use this in our business all the time. We have certain goals in our business that are not climbing the wall. The goals in our business are the pitches. And all it is just another pitch. It's another inch up the wall. If something doesn't work, so we've just launched a coaching program. Our target is 10. We've got 4 people at the moment. We want 10 by the end of the month. If we don't get 10, it doesn't mean we have failed to scale the wall. It's just a pitch that we have to try again. Can we get 10 in September? And if we get that, then we're on to the next pitch. And it's just looking at your goals and the journey you want to go on in that way. And I highly recommend it. It is the most incredible film about endurance and perseverance and the mental strength, let alone the physical strength that they need to have. So I highly recommend you watch that, and the perception that it'll give you on failure and trying again and again and again, I can't recommend highly enough. Which brings me onto these guys. The big four, as they're known, for me the big four is more Metallica, Anthrax, Megadeth, that side of things, but the big four. Now, there is and I suppose I am now a British citizen, but a typically British tendency that Andy Murray is seen as a bit of a failure and shouldn't really be up there with these four. It's 3 Grand Slams, 2 Olympic gold medals, Davis Cup, everything, and I mean being able to play tennis after his hip surgery, let alone actually wanting to compete. If you said to a 10-year-old kid that you were coaching, that's what you can achieve, they'll never describe themselves as a failure of any sort, having achieved that. On the other end of the scale is Roger Federer. More Grand Slams than anyone else, and arguably the best player ever to pick up a racket. What I found really interesting, especially now with a stat that you said about McEnroe, which I didn't know about, is out of these four, Roger Federer has the lowest winning ratio. But by some margin, he has entered and played more tournaments than the other three. He has put himself forward for failure more often than the other guys. And that's partly why he is more successful than any of them, because he's willing to take that risk again and again. Another example, Ronnie OSullivan. He might have had a few more in the last couple of weeks since I checked, but 1,009 career centuries, 15 competitive 147s, maximum breaks, 5 world championships, and let alone what else. But in his 28-year career to date, he has played over 11,300 competitive frames of snooker. So if you think about that, that's more than 10,300 frames of snooker where he didn't get a century. He failed to get a century. It's nearly 11,285 frames of snooker where he didn't get a maximum break. But he put himself forward again and again, step up to the table and take another chance, regardless of what happened in the previous match, the previous frame, anything like that. So that's over time scale, which I think we need to adjust how we look at our failures and what we're willing to do. The other is our perspective on going back to the fact that we are going to die. She'll love me for using this photo. So that's Sophie. And I always, she's my perspective on anything that I try to do and anything that doesn't work. Because Sophie is an oncology consultant, primarily breast cancer. And she goes to work every day trying to save someone's life. I just work with ones and zeros and string bits of code together. Well, in reality, I get someone else to string the code together. We just design this stuff. And it gives me perspective on the fact that, so what if it doesn't work out? I can try again. She spent 4 years doing a PhD, going off to the surgery theatre to go and collect bits of flesh, go back to the lab, cut it up in thin slices, stain it with chemicals, doing experiments for 4 years to try and get a result, to try and prove that there's a theory they have about a particular protein, it's called EN2, and whether that helps early detection of breast cancer, things like that. And it's just great for me that every morning after breakfast when she goes to work, it's a reminder that whatever's going to happen to me today is going to be easy in comparison. Any risks I have to take, anything that I'm trying to achieve is to a large extent inconsequential for it. So, to go back to this, you are going to die and everyone will forget your name. And it is actually really positive, because medical at the moment, we're likely to live 80, 85. And I try and instill this in my kids. We're very open about talking about death in our house. And I'll never forget, I think Emily was about 5, and she said, "Oh, how old will I be in 90 years' time? How old will she be?" And I said, "Oh, you'll be 95. And how old will I be?" It was like, "I'll be, I don't know, 130 or something." But I said, "I'd be 130, but I'm more likely to be dead by the time you're 95. And of course, then she runs off, grandma picks her up, and the first thing in the car is, "Daddy's going to die." It's like, yes, that is factually correct, but not yet, as far as I know. So, yes, we can all die tomorrow, and that's a different motivation or anything, but if we're all going to live to 80, 85, so what if you fuck it up? You reach 40, it didn't go to plan, try again. 50, try again. It really doesn't matter. If that's the time scale, just have another go. But then, like you say with your friends at school, really stressing out about everything, the other side is, so I'm still closer to the start, on average, to what I am to the end. If my girls have 80 years ahead of them, I want to make sure they do something they enjoy. Because you can fail at stuff you hate doing. So you may as well have a go at the stuff you really want to do, the stuff you're passionate about, that actually gets you out of bed in the morning, regardless of what you've ended up doing, a bit like Nick being a plumber. So spend this time doing something you enjoy and be willing to take risks to achieve that and to retain that. And that's because you are, and I'll give Jordan Peterson credit for this, you are a village. Each individually, we are all a village. We just are spread out over a timeline. So, as an example, I discipline Amelie now. She's nearly 9. I encourage her. I'm not doing it for the 9-year-old Amelie. It's too late. There's nothing I can do for the 9-year-old Amelie other than keep her warm and safe. I'm disciplining her because I owe it to the 16-year-old Amelie, and I owe it to the 25-year-old Amelie. The same way that I owe it to the 50-year-old me to do the things that I enjoy, to take the risks, to achieve the goals that I want. And I owe it to my 70-year-old me, and each one of us is like that. You owe it to your future self to actually do the things you really want to do. But that's very narcissistic. It's a very short time scale. 80 years sounds like a long time, but it really isn't. Because if you then think about it, if that's not enough motivation for you to take the risk and to just face the fear and be willing to fail, what about doing it for those people who will have forgotten your name? So I think it's about 11% of people in a study could remember the names of all 8 of their great-grandparents. I don't know the names of any of mine. But I know that what they did had an impact on where I ended up, at least where I started life. So what things are you not doing because of your fear of failure and taking risk that could positively impact the people who will forget your name? Thank you very much.